were actually covered under race relations legislation. When we had 9/11 as well, what we saw was the rise of a group. One particular political party was the British National Party. These were a far-right neo-Nazi group that had really been kind of come out of the kind of football hooligan movement in the kind of like the National Front and Combat 18 in the 70s, 80s and 90s. But they got a new leader in the 1990s who wanted to make this much more respectable party. So rather than being the kind of the party where they would be like sort of working on the football terraces, they decided to wear suits, and they were going into the kind of areas where the mainstream politicians wouldn't. And one of the things that became very easy to do was say, well, you know, look at your housing, look at your schools, look how bad those are. But have you seen that big mosque down the road? Because that's where all the money's going from the council. And none of this was ever true. It was called bread and butter politics. But the BNP, the British National Party, was so good at this that they actually began to win seats all around, you know, in these very deprived areas. And you saw at the kind of local government level, you saw this right across the country. After 7/7, after the London public transport attacks on the 7th of July 2005, immediately the BNP, the British National Party, saw this opportunity to exploit this. And we then had local council elections in 2007. And the British National Party won more seats than any far-right party had ever done before in the UK. And they became the first official party of opposition in London Borough of Barking and Dagenham. And if anybody knows London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, it's hugely diverse with a high percentage of Muslims living in that area. The party then kind of began to wane after this, but what we saw the far right really change, because what we saw was that traditionally the far right groups would always be against the Jewish communities. They would always be, you know, there would be the focus on, you know, Judaism, on Jewish communities and the problems of Jews. The far right became very much about Muslims. It was about Islam. And many of the messages that they kind of gave were exactly the same, that Muslims were trying to take over Europe, that immigration was allowing Muslims to create Eurabia, that actually, you know, they were trying to Islamify, you know, society, bringing the introduction of halal meat, all of these kind of ideas, you know, changing the landscape by building mosques and so on. And what we saw was this emergence of this kind of street level group, because the BNP were quickly found out to be a kind of, you know, charlatan organisation. They weren't actually, you know, politicians, they were actually neo-Nazis, and soon they lost their kind of political mainstream. And then we saw the emergence of the English Defence League, and the English Defence League actually became a street movement. So they had no political structure, they had no membership, they had no, you know, sort of, you know, desire whatsoever to actually win votes. They just took their message to the streets and marched against mosques and was in Muslim areas. And they had a division which was, they had a Jewish division, they had an LGBTQ division, they had a Sikh division, a disabled division, you know, and all of these just go completely against, you know, the kind of history of the far right. You know. But actually what they were united around was that Muslims are a problem and that Islam should be in Britain. And this has become something which has then, you know, increasingly moved into the mainstream, and Nash picks up on this with Brexit. We had the UK Independence Party, which actually, if you look at the last general election, really their policy document was actually exactly the same as what the English Defence League and the British National Party were asking for 10 years ago. And I wanted to just wrap up in that because we can't disentangle the far right from Britain from Islamophobia. We now have a group called Britain First who now go around and do Christian patrols. None of them are linked to any church whatsoever, but and they go around in armoured vehicles in Muslim areas, and they video these and put these online. They also do mosque invasions, where, you know, they don't go on the Friday prayers when there's lots of young Muslim men there, you know, that might resist them, but they go during the morning when there's probably a couple of elderly guys there who are looking after the mosque, and then invade it, video it, and then put those online. But I think just to wrap that up, one of the things we find is that, and you know, Islamophobia is we can talk about it as this kind of abstract thing, but it's also very, very real. One part of my research has been to interview Muslim women who have been victims of Islamophobic hate crime at the street level. And it really does affect their day-to-day life, you know. So we can talk about this stuff, we can talk about ideology, we can talk about extremism, we can talk about all these things. But actually, when it comes down to real life, and you know, these are people that are going about their everyday business. They're just their day-to-day lives. They're taking their kids to school. They're going to do their shopping. All of these kind of things. And actually, Islamophobia attacks that. And if I can just wrap up one example. The most shocking example I've ever heard was that two young Muslim girls, that were teenagers, got onto a train. And they were sitting together on the train. They were travelling into I won't say where because I have to keep it anonymous because of our research. But a group of what were described as white British. There was 3 girls and the guy. And they decided to sit around the 2 Muslim girls and begin to like sort of give abuse, like, you know, between the stations, and you know, begin to call them terrorists, and, you know, all these kind of things. But then the most shocking part of it was that the 2 of the girls held the 2 Muslim girls down, whilst the guy and the girl actually performed a sex act in front of them. And when they'd finished that, they turned around and said, "That's what you're missing in Islam. You know, this is what we can do in the West." And that sort of thing, you know, becomes so real and awful. And you think to yourself, like, you know, we can talk about, you know, the anti-Muslim hate, and we can talk about it abstract, but actually the effect that that has on real individuals is really, really shocking. And that's why my research has been so much around really trying to tackle this, because actually none of us should actually, for whatever reason, should be able to experience that sort of discrimination or prejudice.